Our next session, our speakers are already on the panel. This session is very, very close to my heart. I have been born in a country, in a city that was left by Russian forces 3 years before my birth. So I have nothing but tremendous respect for all the people on this panel and everyone who's fighting for the liberation of their own country from Russian aggression today. All of our speakers, Alexander Sikorski, Hanna Liubakova, Maryan Zablotskiy, and Dr. Tom Palmer are doing exactly that, working day and night to liberate Ukraine and Belarus from oppressive forces. Alexander is a senior policy advisor at the Human Rights Foundation, where he focuses on democracy, human rights, and corruption in Eastern Europe. He's also the manager of the organization's Ukraine Solidarity Fund, which provides humanitarian and financial aid to support Ukraine. Welcome on the panel. Hanna is a Belarusian journalist, analyst, and a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And in the past years, she has written about the latest developments in Belarus for the Washington Post, The Economist, and Open Democracy. We also have Maryan, who is a member of the Ukrainian parliament and a friend of liberty in all its forms. Maryan and his colleagues were working tirelessly in the parliament in Kiev, even during the heaviest days of Russian shelling, in order to ensure that Ukraine can become the poster country of economic liberalization and of social freedoms in the years to come. We are very honored to have you here, Maryan. Thank you for joining. And finally, we have the gentleman who needs no introduction, as he's the mentor and the inspiration for so many of us in the liberty movement, Dr. Tom Palmer, the executive director of Atlas Network and the member of Students for Liberty's Board of Advisors, and the person who is very, very much invested in fighting for freedom in Eastern Europe.
Okay, thank you very much, Adam. It's wonderful to be at another Students for Liberty event. The energy is so contagious. It's great to be among positive, forward-thinking people. At the same time, we recognize that we're no longer in the afterglow of the collapse of communism. For a long time, we felt things were going so well. There was this very positive afterglow that has all come to an end as Russia, core group of the nation of the former Soviet Union, has come under the influence of what I call failed empire syndrome. We once had a great empire and the world feared us, and that's no longer true. And it's exactly what was experienced in Germany. We won in the East and we were stabbed in the back and lost. And we lost our empire. And we know what that led to, the horror that emerged in Germany. And the same playbook is being played out. So let me read you a quick quote from 1941 from Karl Joachim Friedrich, who was a German academic who left the United States, became quite an enemy of fascism. And he quoted Hermann Rauschning, who from his personal conversations with Hitler, quoted Hitler as follows: "Artillery preparation before an attack, as during the World War," referring to World War I, "will be replaced in the future war by the psychological dislocation of the adversary through revolutionary propaganda." And Friedrich asked, he said, how can we combat this without becoming ourselves totalitarians? That was the challenge he posed in 1941, how to save our liberal democracies from this vicious assault without becoming like the enemy. So I'd like to start with Alexander. In the European context, how do we trace and identify these forms of Kremlin efforts, subversion of liberal democracy, and what do you think people here can do to combat it?
Thank you very much, Tom. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for hosting us in Lisbon. It's a beautiful city. I want to, first of all, make it clear that this opening barrage, this artillery strike, did not start just before the 24th of February. Russia, under Vladimir Putin's leadership, has actually been attacking European liberal institutions, European democratic values, and liberty for a lot longer. And this has been an imperial mindset. They have done invasions, not just of Ukraine, but they invaded Ukraine in 2014. They practiced the current war in Syria in 2015. They invaded Georgia in 2008. And since Putin's time in power, there has been this hybrid warfare within Europe as well. The targeting of liberal institutions, of media institutions, seeking to undermine these pillars of a free and democratic society with things like cyber attacks, with disinformation, with the willful spreading of false information to undermine confidence in truth, with the use of corruption and oligarchs who are gaining positions in Western society, with the bribery of Western politicians to promote a Russian perspective. And so all of these, this has all been part of the Russian playbook for a long time, even going back to the Soviet Union, when this was called desinformatia. And it was actually for the first time used against Ronald Reagan in the 80s, when they deliberately planted false information about the origins of the AIDS epidemic, claiming that it was a US-funded attempt to undermine Africa. And so this has been a long strategy of Putin, and there's a role for governments, there's a role for private organizations, and there's a role for individuals in combating this. Governments have a role. I know there's a lot of libertarians here, but governments need to do more to ensure that there's transparency in understanding where the sources of money comes from when it's being used to influence politics. So we have to understand that we need to treat the Russians in Putin's regime as criminals. This is a criminal organization that is attacking Ukraine. These are criminal actions. We need to make sure that the money made through these crimes is not seeking into our political systems. And so governments have a role in making sure that our financial systems are clear of that kind of money so that sanctions aren't evaded, so that these individuals don't have an effect on our politics. Private organizations also have a role. A lot of the work that Russian oligarchs and Russian agents of influence do are facilitated by Western banks, by Western law firms, PR firms, lobbyists, and other other companies that are dodging sanctions and providing material to aid Putin's war effort. And so we need to make sure that companies are following the rules, and that when they are engaged in free enterprise, they're doing that on the grounds of equal exchange and not aiding these criminal organizations in Russia. And finally, individuals also have a role. I want to make sure it's important to understand that there is a lot of false narratives out there, and often the goal of these false narratives is not necessarily just to convince you to think something else, but it's to convince you that you shouldn't believe anything at all. That, oh, there's so many narratives out there, it's impossible to tell which is true, therefore I'm not even going to care. And so my appeal to you all, everyone who's here, is to actually to see if the source is the news source that you're reading or watching, is it trying to spark an emotion in you? Is it presenting the facts in an equal manner? You should be an important thing is to come offline and to actually talk to people who are on the ground. So when you're thinking about ways in which we can fight misinformation, ways that we can counter Russian narrative, of course, check your sources, make sure you're following good news organizations, but also engage in the topics that you're interested in, vote in elections, talk to people who are on the ground, talk to people who have real experience. Don't just see whatever narrative you see online and believe it, or choose not to believe anything.
Hanna, we've watched in horror as Belarus, which has been a dictatorship for so long, but now is a virtual colony of Russia today, a satellite state, and those brave people who've spoken out have suffered very heavy repression as a consequence. I know Students for Liberty has been active in Belarus and deserves a great deal of credit for that bravery. Tell us, what do you think, from your perspective, people in Europe should be aware of? What should they be doing?
Towards Belarus.
To help Belarus, but also to make sure that this malign influence isn't spreading even further.
So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with the situation in Belarus and what happened in the past 3 years at this point. So in 2020, we had this massive protest, we had a massive revolution against the dictatorship because yet again the presidential election was rigged. And tens of thousands of people got arrested after that. Since 2020, now there are more than 1,500 political prisoners in Belarus. And Belarus is a country of 9.5 million. So Portugal is like 10.5, so it's kind of like Portugal, a bit less. So imagine the scale. In 2020, Putin supported Lukashenko by promising to send police reserve, to send security forces to sort of disperse people from the streets if protests would become violent. This never happened, but I think the support was crucial, and Lukashenko felt more confident because of that. And we had, of course, brutal state terror, and people were dispersed, and we ended up in prisons. And since then, Lukashenko has to pay back, right? And now, as we know, he supports the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The regime of Belarus is offering the territory of my country for the attack. Hundreds of missiles were launched from the territory of Belarus, despite people clearly are against the deployment of Belarusian troops, against those attacks of Ukraine from the territory of Belarus, and we have research that confirms it. But again, due to this like high level of repression in Belarus, it's not possible to openly protest. But we have this underground movement in the country. We had partisans, we call them, who in the first months of the war stopped the movement of Russian troops in Belarus, like through the territory of Belarus. Now we have this amazing network of people, 30,000 people, witnesses on the ground who submit information about the movement of Russian troops, whatever they do in the country. We call this initiative Belaruski Hayun. And this basically shows how people are still organized and how they're trying to help on the grassroots level, despite all these repressions. And I think information now became one of the most important things of how to tackle that propaganda that the Russians, the Kremlin is sort of, that is prevalent in Belarus, because I think before 2020, there was of course pro-Kremlin propaganda, but to some extent the regime in Minsk, the regime in Belarus tries to control it, because Lukashenko loves his power, and he also considered Putin as some of rival in a way, so he never allowed this Russian influence to be so widespread in Belarus. And this is not the case anymore because of that support that he received in 2020, because he's so reliant on the Kremlin right now. The regime in Belarus is like a chair, so Lukashenko's power is like a chair that has 3 legs. One of them is the Kremlin, another one is his power vertical, these officials, MPs, and people who support him, and security forces. And if we destroy one leg, then it's kind of easier to destroy the whole chair, right? So information became crucial, and that information that we receive from people, but also something that we as journalists, as analysts, are able to deliver inside the country. And reaching those people who are not politicized, who might not be so much interested in political information and so on, who have not decided yet on what side they are. This became one of the most crucial things. We do it via several ways. So we reach people on the ground, for example, through self-made newspapers, because the regime blocked information, websites are blocked. And how would you reach people, like if you cannot sort of publish information there? Then what we do, so we create like PDFs with information, people on the ground print them and spread in their cities, in their towns, in their villages. We also reach security forces, we reach army and officials via targeted ads, for example. We know their addresses, and this is how we reach, we target them with this information. And of course, the role of generally of independent media became very crucial, and this is one of the reasons why the absolute majority of Belarusians is against the attacks of Ukraine from the territory of Belarus and against the deployment of Belarusian troops to Ukraine, and that's why this hasn't happened yet.
We're all inspired by the courage of the people doing exactly what you're talking about. Maryan, we've known each other for a long time, over a decade working in Ukraine. What has the world known, or what should they know now more clearly than was the case before February of last year.
Thank you for having me, for this opportunity. You should know that the vast majority of money and advocacy oriented against eliminating freedom is based on one single office in Moscow, in Russia, in FSB. It has been that for the last 120 years. They've generated the worst regimes, the worst ideologies. It's due to them that Cuba is not free, Venezuela is currently not free. Same things happening in Africa, North Korea. Communist regime from China is still there. All generated in Russia, and it's generated on purpose. Imagine yourself that there is basically a Resident Evil office that is generating, like literally, we saw them, dozens and dozens presentations, very detailed, on how to attack your democratic systems. And they basically have an unlimited budget. The problem for them is not the money, but the ability to spend it, which is sometimes limited. But they literally have thousands of people with specific departments dedicated to specific countries. They study the problems, they integrate their companies, they study everything. Everything that Russia has inside your countries is being used for that purpose. Even if it starts as a legitimate business, soon the FSB knows about it and tries to use those companies in your countries to subvert, to hire manager politicians, to impact narratives, to sponsor football clubs, sponsor media, etc., etc. Statistically, if you dedicate yourself to fighting freedom to the rest of your life or whatever period, you're almost certainly will fight FSB at one point in time. It's a statistical certainty. It should be understood, and you should do everything as a matter of principle to advocate your countries not to have any relationships with Russia until they have this deadly regime. Even if it starts well, even if it starts with good people, problems will come. I do not really like the word sanctions as much because it's like punishing Russia. Of course, the regime should be punished for that. But I would rather call it distancing. When we advocate sanctions on Russia, it's not because our first worry, to be honest, is because of their potential influence on your countries. We worry that gas stations that Lukoil or whatever Gazprom has in your countries will be used to sponsor whatever political parties in your countries. And you see that in the recent Washington Post article. They will sponsor far left and far right. When you have debates in your countries, which political party is pro-Russian and who Russia supports, trust me, they hate all of you. They will support whatever conflict, whatever most destructive forces on the left or the right possible to make your country weaker, to send you in a debate that normal policy issues become personal. They go into conflicts and make your countries weaker. I believe firmly that there should be a systemic policy from freedom-loving organizations to understand that this is generated from there. The best way to do this is to advocate to cut all ties with Russia in principle, and hopefully wait until the moment when Russia, if at all possible, if we will see this in one generation, does become a democracy. For me, the silver lining moment will be when they finally throw up Lenin into a dumpster. Until they keep this perversion of trying to keep that body alive and still praise it, there is no talking to them, in my opinion. Thank you.
Maryan mentioned the release 2 days ago of a tranche of intelligence documents on the effect of the FSB, the efforts to undermine German politics, very explicit appeals, bring the extreme left and the extreme right together, and marry. This is effectively what the Russian regime is, Stalinism and Hitlerism producing this Putler baby. And the plan was laid out very clearly with particular named political figures, Sarah Wagenknecht being prominent among them, as promoting and being tools of a Kremlin agenda. And I think we are seeing this, and we need to open our eyes. But I want to pose a question. How do we combat this without becoming like them? This is the question that Karl Joachim Friedrich posed in 1941. And I think it's one that we face today. On the one hand, RTL, or the Russia Today, and all of their spin-offs. By the way, there are hundreds of them, that you would never know are products of the Kremlin unless you do a great deal of investigation, because they traffic in cat videos and things that catch the attention, and then every 20th video is Kremlin propaganda. 19 cat videos and one ugly anti-Ukrainian or vicious propaganda. They promote racism of all sorts, ethnic division, hatred, polarization, in order to get people in democratic countries to hate each other. We can no longer disagree, we have to hate our enemies. That is a tool for the destruction of democracy as such, and liberalism. So just to pose and start with you again, how do we combat it without becoming like them?
Well, I think it's important to understand that freedom is not something that can be achieved and left alone. Freedom is something that has to be won and fought for every single day, and people need to be convinced that freedom is worth fighting for every single day. So one way to combat this is to go out there every single day and say freedom is important, democracy is important, the liberal values that we have, freedom of speech, freedom of the judiciary, freedom of trade, these are all values worth fighting for, and convincing people these are worth fighting for. And so to do these things, you need to make sure that everyone is always voting in elections. Elections are not just it is not a privilege, it's a responsibility to vote if you live in a democratic system. And so every day reaffirming the rights that you have as a citizen of a democracy is an important way to fight this. There are also, demanding higher standards of our politicians is something that's very important. In Europe, we have, unfortunately, examples of politicians at the very highest level, and not just in the far-right or far-left parties, but in mainstream parties like in the German Social Democrats. Their former Chancellor, Gerhard Schroeder, as soon as he left office, went onto the board of Rosneft, which is one of the Russian gas companies. The former French Prime Minister, François Fillon, also accepted a board position with a Russian company as soon as he left office. And you have even the friendship of someone like Italy's Berlusconi, who even today is talking about how great of a person Putin is and how friendly he is with him, and how he's simply been misunderstood. So it's about being engaged in the practice of democracy every day, being engaged in the practice of free media, but also about demanding more of your politicians, demanding that politicians adhere to the same standards that you want to see.
It's asking a lot, but it's a good demand. We'll have some time for discussion with the audience, so let's try to keep some answers short. As a journalist, how do you think we should, I guess I'd say, balance the combating the misinformation and disinformation and maintaining an open and free society? How do we do both?
I studied in the UK, and one of the topics that I did for my master's degree, my dissertation focused on RT UK, Russia Today in the UK. And it was 2016, so it was right after Brexit happened. So you imagine it was very interesting. And what I found out, so I analyzed their broadcasting, and what I found out was that British politicians from the left and from the far right went on RT, and what they said was surprisingly, they said of course different things, as you imagine, but they said the things that were in the interest of the Kremlin, that the Kremlin then used against Britain, against democracy and so on. Of course, their main goal is to create divisions, is to increase polarization, is to blur the facts, and sort of how to say that, to sort of, so we don't understand where the truth is. There are so many truths, right? Where is it? Where is it? So we don't care anymore. So I'd say that instead of focusing on only on tackling and fighting against disinformation, against fakery, we also need to invest in critical thinking and civic education, because these are very important things. So children, students in the beginning know how to discern facts from falsehoods. That will be important. And of course, I totally agree with what Alexandra said. That's also important. And we see how the role of sort of independent media is important everywhere, right? And we cannot sort of ignore it, and we cannot think that people know the truth or they would have access to the truth, right? Because it's very easy to deprive them of that access, as the example of Belarus shows. But it also doesn't mean that people who have access to free, accurate, unbiased information would want this access. So we need them to become interested in getting this information, and this is where critical thinking, I think, comes.
It's a question also of calling them out in some cases. When we hear people who are clearly spokespeople for totalitarian regimes, just explain exactly what's going on here and not be afraid of their charges that you're censoring me or you're canceling me because you're being critical. Maryan, what are your thoughts from a European, which includes Ukraine, but let's set that out, look at this Western European context?
First of all, I think the first point you need to start is to gather intelligence. What is the Russian presence? Who is advocating that? And follow the money. What we found out from Ukrainian experience that we severely underestimated the vastness of networks that they create. Basically, every day now in Ukraine, we have 1 or 2 arrests of different groups of collaborators in Ukraine, not on the front line, within. Our best estimate is that they managed to create a network of well over 10,000 people. Why they were so confident when they were invading Ukraine that everything was so good? Because they had some people on the payroll, or at least they thought that they had them, right? Because once you give money to FSB to corrupt someone, of course, a lot will get lost in the process. But after the Russian invasion, we had to fire the chief of our state security agency. So the chief of agency that was responsible for counterintelligence, as we understand, was turned by the Russians. We uncovered and we see networks that they do not only corrupt journalists. We had to implement sanctions on TV channels in Ukraine because we found Russian connections. We saw them installing different equipment into government offices, which was compromised. So some of the things that you may see from spy movies, they actually do this, and this is not like a conspiracy, and they do the same thing in your countries. What we found out in Ukraine, it's not difficult to expose them and understand them. Basically, investigative journalists like Bellingcat, they were able to detect many agents of Russians going back and forth. And you can do the same. Understand that if somebody starts being very pro-Russian, 90% that has been financed by Russia. And since they do not organize themselves that well, you will almost certainly find how to expose that just by following publicly available information. So actually our most common tool was Cosint, right? We just followed their trail of companies and transactions and found out who was financing whom. I suggest you do the same thing in your countries, right? Follow the money and do what we do in Ukraine. We create the list, public list of people on Russian payroll. We found a link, create a database, and there are different ones in Ukraine. One is called Peacekeeper and another one is called Molfa, where you can just go and see, well, these are the guys associated with Russia. It's not enough for criminal prosecutions, otherwise they would have been in jail, but you can find evidence that one way or another they've been exposed. Create these registries in your countries and for yourself understand the scale of the problem, because they literally spend billions of dollars on that, right? Or even if you take all of the Liberty Movement organizations' budgets combined, that's probably what they spend, I do not know, on Portugal.
No, that's actually just pocket change.
Yes.
Let's see if we have a little bit of time for some discussion from the audience. Anyone like to put up a hand? Right here, the front row here.
So one of the most disturbing things, personally, is the way that these sorts of regimes have perverted history into sort of memory. That there is history, there is the facts, and then there's the memory of it, the way that they've emotionally colored it, right? In history, Russia after the 90s was actually helped and almost was in the antechamber of joining Western alliances. But in the memory that Putin put up, Russia was humiliated, and it must be brought back to its current status. And I see this sort of memory spun out of history constantly. I'm really worried about it, like my neighboring country, Hungary. That's happening all the time. Viktor Orban's Greater Hungary scarf recently, and we need to get back to the Trianon. We've been unfairly judged, right? So I think I'm kind of pessimistic about the chances of getting to those people simply by facts or critical thinking at that point. So I think my question is, what sort of politics of memory can we as liberals do to counteract this politics of memory?
I'll just start very quickly. It's a very deep question, and I think what is important is to identify a civic identity as a free citizen. It is not uniquely ethno or linguistic. And so the Russian state is saying, those people speak Russian, they're ours. As if the United Kingdom would say, those Canadians really should be ours, and we get to reconquer it. So that's a very important point, that you can have a civic identity of equal free citizens under a constitutional order of rule of law, rather than an ethno-national or linguistic or religious monoculture, which is what these authoritarian states promote. But it's a hard problem for us to promote civic identity rather than ethno-linguistic or religious identity. Any other thoughts on this?
Just on the topic of memory, and memory especially in Russia, I don't think there will be anything we can do better for changing Russian memory than defeating Russia in Ukraine. Because right now, in the Russian imagination, Ukraine is a former colony, it's part of Russia's territory, they're so-called brotherly peoples, and nothing will be better for erasing that memory permanently than defeating the Russian army, kicking them out of Ukraine, and bringing Ukraine into Western alliance so that a Russian invasion of Ukraine can never happen again. So if we remember our history and what happened in Germany, the reason German memory was changed after 1945 was that fascism was completely defeated and was rooted out of Germany. And so the same thing has to happen in Russia today. Russia needs to be completely defeated. It has to be made to understand that Ukraine is never going to be a part of Russia, and that is the only way for the Russian people to understand that their memory has to change and that they have to find a new way of expressing their national identity rather than through this imperial mythology.
Let's turn to another question here.
During the Vietnam War, a lot of Americans fled to Canada as conscientious objectors. They're as a libertarian, one of the things that I've struggled to put into context is that there are a lot of Russians who are trying to flee from conscription who've been blocked from leaving Russia by Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. They've been canceling their Schengen visas and blocking them from leaving. What are your thoughts as a liberty-minded panel on that practice?
You want to deal with that?
Well, the problem is that still vast majority of those who leave Russia still support the war effort, unfortunately. War still has the popular support of regular Russians. I think it would be appropriate if those Russians who declare that they do not support the regime, then they can leave. Otherwise, what's the point? To be honest, we would rather have fighting those who do not want to fight. It would lower the losses of Ukrainian lives. Then the best adversary is unmotivated soldier.
I'm going to disagree a little bit with Maryan on this. I think there's a problem, and that is someone who's trying to get out, who has to declare in advance, I'm an enemy of the regime, is in a big problem within Russia. You can only declare that once you're out of Russia. And so a regime that allowed people to do that needs to be sensitive to that and say, if you're out, maybe a condition is to say, I am opposed to this imperialistic war, possibly. But I also think that just not wanting to die is an acceptable reason to want to escape a totalitarian state, and it's one less piece of cannon fodder to have to end up running against Ukrainian positions. So I understand the sentiment, but I worry if you demand that they make the statement before, you're just going to be arrested.
In any case, they cannot go to Europe or US directly. They always go through Turkey and other countries because there is no connection. So in any case, first they go to a third country and then they can declare it. There is no basically connection direct one because everything's been cut.
We did have a question over here. I want to get more. Do you have a quick response, and then we'll go to this?
Sure, I just want to add to that, you know, Russians who are just fearful for their lives have the option of leaving to safer countries, whether that be Armenia or Kazakhstan. They don't necessarily need to come to Western Europe. And part of, I think, the instinct behind wanting Russians to declare their opposition to the war is that for so long, so many Russians have benefited from the war in some way, whether they work for a state company, whether they work for the Russian government in some way, have been able to enjoy all the liberties and freedoms of the West while they're actively participating in the subjugation of those liberties in Russia and in the criminal war against Ukraine.
Over here.
Great, thank you. What I'm interested in is kind of what do we say to our isolationist, kind of isolationist libertarians and conservatives who use this sort of Russian influence, you know, not in a pro-Russian sense, but in kind of a, you know, keep the West out of the war sense. What do we say to them?
The question is whether Russia wants to be an isolationist. Is it an isolationist state? No. Does it need to directly cross the border with its troops to US or France to make havoc? No. It does so very successfully by trying to destroy you from within and by hacking, by money laundering, by corruption, and it's very effective. So if your neighbor is not isolationist, right, if your next door neighbor, does he really have to go through the world through your door to make your life a misery? No. And that's what it is. Basically what we have now is a union of asshole regimes, where the weapons that are used in Ukraine are Russian, North Korean, Venezuelan, and Iranian. What do they have in common? The worst neighbors ever, right? They are absolutely as anti-isolationists as possible. We would love them to be isolationists. We would love to say, fine, we don't touch you and you don't touch me. But unfortunately, that's what we have to do. And the thing is that you can allow us to win a war like that. You know, we are very grateful for 31 Abrams tanks given to Ukraine by US and for all the other weapons. But US has 8,000 tanks. Would US be less safe with 7,000 tanks? Even with 500 tanks, we can beat them in 2 months. We are extremely grateful for like 2,000 HIMARS systems. Really, they really changed the battlefield. But US has 1,200. There are talks of, okay, how many weapons is it safe to give to Ukraine and get through those Russian narratives? Okay, Egypt has 1,300 Abrams tanks. And currently their next order is the new Russian T-90 tanks. So the only thing that is keeping Ukraine from winning the war, and very quickly, to be honest, and saving our lives, is by providing a very small fraction of the military equipment that you have. Actually, roughly 2 to 3% of just active military hardware that EU or the US has will let us win the war very easily. Basically, what we have now is very important, but to be honest, it's not more than test specimens. I don't know, so 31 Abrams tanks, significant, they will save lives, but hundreds would be enough to win the war.
The British philosopher Blood Wexler, who has covered the war quite extensively on YouTube, has put forward another issue with Russian propaganda, with the perversiveness of it, namely, what stops us from attributing every political opinion that we don't like to Russian propaganda. So, for example, if we are liberals and someone proposes to nationalize any industry, what stops us from saying, well, that's so stupid, it must be Russian propaganda, so I don't really need to discuss this.
And it's a good point. So Maryan and I disagree on, take the list of issues, right? Abortion, tax question. And he says, Tom, you're just a Russian propagandist. How do we distinguish between that and identifying the actual voices of Kremlin policy? Any thoughts on that as a journalistic matter? Because it's a profound question. We don't want to end up in a world in which we just accuse everyone we disagree with of bad faith. That's part of that totalitarian temptation, the danger that combating a totalitarian state. And Russia today is a totalitarian state. They arrest people because their 12-year-old daughters draw crayon pictures saying no to war. That is a totalitarian state. How do we combat it without becoming more like it? It's a problem for all of us. And we're wrapping up here, so unless you have a quick thought how to maintain our freedom in the face of a determined set of adversaries.
No, I mean, we don't really have much time. That's a great question, a great discussion that we can continue, I think. But of course, the freedom of debate, the freedom of speech is super important. When it comes to Russian propaganda, what does it mean? It means that it's the Kremlin's point of view. It's something that would work in their interest, correct? So the ability to distinguish between those two is crucial. When it comes to propaganda in general, like how do we approach it? How do we name something as propaganda, right? When something that provokes emotions in us, right? Something that we tend to believe, something that is too comfortable to believe in, something that it might be too abstract, right? Something that we cannot relate to. That's why it's easier for us to believe in that, because we never had a chance to sort of see the reality, to tackle this, to know the real facts about that and so on. In Belarus, really quickly, like many people, like they know what happens in Ukraine, right? But some people, of course, who never been to the West, who never been to Ukraine, it's easier for them to believe in what Russians are saying, right? Because Russians are saying that they came to liberate Ukraine. And this is what literally is shown on TV, and that's what many people tend to believe. Well, some people at least. So for them, it's kind of easier to believe that Russians would really do that, would really liberate, than to believe that Russians would really come and kill, peaceful citizens. So, because these are all neighboring countries, right? And they cannot sort of believe that such cruelties are possible. So really something really.
We're gonna have to end there. I'm gonna leave you with one quick thought. Anytime you're someone in your country designating another citizen as an enemy whom you should hate and that you cannot live with them, you can be pretty goddamn sure those people are connected to the Kremlin. Thank you very much.
It's really, truly heroic work that you're doing in Ukraine and Belarus, and I hope in a year's time at the next LibertyCon we will celebrate all the achievements of your hard work. Thank you so much. As we are